Men of War is one of the best-selling World War II strategy games to grace the PC market. It's been around for quite some time now, with the first release back all the way in 2004. Over 13 years later, what happened in this series, what were the highlights, and what went wrong? In this video I'm going to be going over all the Men of War games, and of course those DLCs in there as well, since the very beginning up to the present point, and what I'm hoping for in the future. So welcome everybody to the evolution of Men of War. In 2004 was the release of Soldiers, Heroes of World War II. Now you might be thinking, are you sure that's in the Men of War series? It doesn't have it in the name. But this was actually the first try for the developers of Men of War. You can see by the gameplay the amount of inspiration that they have kept, and they found that loads of things actually worked, so they haven't bothered to take them out even up into 2016 with the newest Men of War games. Soldiers, Heroes of World War II was the original game for the Men of War series. It used the early GEM engine. Here the players could control British, German, Americans and Soviets in multiplayer and of course single player missions as well. Of course, Men of War isn't really the whole total war unit based combat, but more smaller squad based combat, where you're based on leading small amounts of forces into battle against larger enemies. The goal is to use military tactics in the simulation to overcome the enemy with minimal losses. Skipping a year, we come to 2006. This is when another game that doesn't have the same namesake comes into the Men of War franchise. Faces of War is the sequel of Soldiers, Heroes of World War II. Now, yes, this does still use the GEM engine used in the previous game, but it does have quite a lot of new features. The player can now move freely with the camera, and it is now a fully 3D engine. There's destructible environments and things, and that was something that they've definitely kept in the Men of War series and been a massive part of it that players love. Being able to dynamically change your battlefield and not just have the set maps made by developers. Now the player can still control a smaller group of units, but the missions are going up and up in terms of scale. They're trying to get them from these smaller skirmish type games that was in Soldiers, Heroes of World War II and get them to be more on a massive scale. This aspect includes AI units allied to the player and more enemy units and more vehicles. These are some things that we have seen in later Men of War games as well that they've obviously kept in. The multiplayer was also expanded in the new Faces of War game in 2005 with of course more options, modes and things like that, but also making the multiplayer have that larger scale that they tried to get with the sequel. When 2009 rolled around, we had something that really boosted and I think was the big kick-starting point to the Men of War franchise. This was the original Men of War. It was the first game to be put under this name, obviously, and it had a massive single-player campaign at its time of release. Of course, it included the normal expansions that you'd normally expect from a new game in the franchise, like better AI, better graphics, more units and things like that. But the single-player game decided it wanted to revert back a little bit to Soldiers, Heroes of World War II, and it had that style of battle with the smaller squads, of course, putting the player against a larger enemy. It had of course a massive amount of new missions and scenarios the player could use to try and defend points from waves and waves of enemy. And once again the multiplayer was expanded in size. Now upon release, Men of War only had Germany, UK, America and the Soviet Union, but it was eventually increased to 5 factions with the introduction of Japan in a patch later on, but that was only in multiplayer. They didn't have any single player missions for the Japanese side. Then soon after that, still in the year of 2009, Men of War Red Tide comes along. This is an expansion to Men of War, but it's a standalone, so you didn't need the base game to play it. Here, of course, bug fixes and tweaks, better graphics oh so slightly, but there's a larger single player campaign. It had 28 missions across 6 different campaigns with different factions, but of course it didn't actually include any multiplayer features. Now that came at a massive criticism from the fans, since multiplayer had been a massive part of the Men of War franchise. but they did try and combat that with making generally longer and extensively brutal single-player campaigns in Men of War Red Tide compared to the predecessor games in the Men of War franchise. 2011 rolls around and the Men of War team want to push their game series further than they had gone before. And this was due to working on their strengths. Now, many people did love the single player of the previous Men of War games, but Men of War Assault Squad tried to gear towards the multiplayer. And the reasoning for this is because they thought that people were more geared towards playing multiplayer games in Men of War and trying to put all their time and work into that and enhance that before they go on in the franchise. So Men of War was actually the first game in the series. Men of War Assault Squad was actually the first game in the series not to have this story-based campaign, but instead having these sort of missions or skirmish things that you can do if you want to play some single player. But of course, it was geared more towards this massive scale multiplayer battles. The game tried to focus a lot more on infantry and getting in there with the battle instead of using tanks all the time. You wanted to have more micromanaging in the game. So the infantry did have larger squads of troops, but they're less valuable than previous titles, which means you can also get more in the long run. The game has more multiplayer maps, enhanced graphics, more vehicles and infantry, and more. A large array of vehicles and infantry were available with stats according to the unit price. For example, a group of riflemen would have only basic rifle grenades and occasionally only field caps. On the other hand, an elite unit would have upgraded health, anti-tank grenades, helmets and better weaponry. Now, this game did include a number of factions. Of course, we have the original Germany, Great Britain and United States and Soviet Union, but Japan was in there as well. This was the first game in the Men of War franchise to actually get a Game of the Year edition as well, and of course countless amounts of DLC. As 2011 goes on, the Men of War team want to try something different. Now, making up for the lack of a single player in Men of War Assault Squad, the Men of War team went into Men of War Vietnam. Here, the game contains 2 single player campaigns. Now, while multiplayer is in there, it's not really the focus, as I said before. These 2 single player campaigns are set, of course, in Vietnam. One of the campaigns is based on the story of 2 Soviet military consultants and 2 North Vietnamese soldiers caught stranded in enemy territory after being ambushed. Here it shows both sides of the story. Now, of course, it does have most of the assets from World War II games, with only a small group of tanks, vehicles and weapons and troops that are actually new in the Vietnam game, but later on it was obviously a success since a deluxe edition was released later. Tightly packed together in 2012, Men of War Condemned Heroes was released based on the stories of the penal military units of the Soviet Union during World War II. Now, it was a bit more successful than Red Tide, but the game contains a more historical basis, with an encyclopedia accompanying the player through the campaign. This encyclopedia tells the true stories of the penal units of course, the Soviet Union. The missions in the game are specifically brutal, much like Red Tide and Vietnam. The player controls sections of a large number of penal units during the Eastern Front. And of course, you can lead your troops anywhere from base assaults to trench assaults to sabotages to full battles and more things like that. It's more of a grand scale Men of War game and filled with AI controlled allied forces that will support you through the missions. Yes, there is a multiplayer, but unlike Red Tide, however, it's not the focus of the game. Now we're getting into the more modern Men of War games. In 2014, Men of War Assault Squad 2 was released. Now, this is probably my favourite Men of War game in the franchise that I still play to this day. Now, it's probably seen of more of a grand remaster of the original Assault Squad, but it contains a heavily modified and enhanced engine for the game. Now, it has insane graphical improvements over the previous games and includes Steam Workshop integration, which is used massively for mods such as Rob's Realism mod, which is one of the most popular ones used today. The multiplayer is on a much larger and extensive scale with more modes and units, and the Steam matchmaking integration is also presented on a much more dedicated scale as well. The game is considered one of the most popular and successful Men of War games in the series. In 2016, something came along that I don't think many people were expecting, and this is Assault Squad 2 Men of War Origins. Now, Assault Squad 2 Men of War Origins is a remaster of the original Men of War that I mentioned previously in the video. It's based on the modified and enhanced Assault Squad 2 gem engine, and the game is a standalone title for Men of War and Assault Squad 2. Along the release with Men of War Origins, a large free update with the enhanced models for Men of War Origins was released for Assault Squad 2, and the original campaign of Men of War was included, to enhanced and modified for modernization. Multiplayer, of course, is included in the style of Men of War. And finally, what do they have upcoming? Soldiers Arena is an upcoming title from the original developers of Soldiers Heroes of World War II, Faces of War, and of course, the first Men of War. The game is set in World War II yet again, however the game is based mainly on larger scale strategic multiplayer battles instead of a single player missions and things like that. They all may be included later, but not to start with. Of course, there will be workshop integration for mods and things like that, and the game is on an independently developed and enhanced gem engine, which of course is the engine used for the Men of War games. It's created by the original makers of the engine, so it's going to have a lot of similarities, but the game is under the Soldiers name instead of the Men of War game, as a result of copyrights and things like that since of previous developers and passing the baton on. Now that is the main list of games in the Men of War franchise. Of course, there are other games such as Battle of Empires, which is a World War I spin-off made by different developers but on the same engine, Call to Arms, which is a more modern day one as well, Gates of Hell, and Red Rising Eastern Trident, but they're not ones in the Men of War series, so I thought not to include them. But if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this and other things due to historical games. But other than that guys, I will see you in the next one.